what I'm going to be saying to you, particularly about how important it is to think about the way that we map data. I actually think that I'm probably a frustrated geographer, but we'll come on to that in a little while. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start out by just explaining to you a little bit about what crime science actually is, because it's a new discipline really, and I just want to explain why we're perhaps a little bit distinct from perhaps what we might call more traditional criminology. And then I want to go on to explain about our thinking when it comes to the different innovative data sets that are out there that are available for exploitation in the research that I do in crime science. And sort of thinking about these new sources of data brings all sorts of interesting questions and interesting issues about things like privacy and about accuracy, and I'll be touching on some of those, and we can think a little bit more about that later on maybe. One of the important themes of what I'm going to say is about how we keep data safe, particularly when it's individual level data that's been provided by an organisation which has information about perhaps even the movement of individuals. We need to think about the safety implications of those kind of data sources. So just to begin by explaining what crime science is, this is the kind of technical definition we give the world. It's the application of scientific methods and knowledge from a wide range of different disciplines to the development of practical and ethical ways to reduce crime. And really that means in a nutshell that we just do research that tries to help out there in the real world in terms of crime reduction. A lot of the day-to-day activity of what we do is talking to the police, talking to crime prevention practitioners. What we want to make sure that we do as an organisation is really good applied research that has a real world implication. And we strive to do that by stripping from any discipline we can find that might be useful, and we take a very broad problem-solving approach. It's absolutely no mistake at all that we're in the engineering faculty, because what we do is problem-solving. So when I thought about this kind of idea of big data, it's interesting because big data is one of these buzzwords. We all hear about big data all the time. So I actually went off and looked at what the definition is, because I'm not convinced that people really quite understand what this is anyway, and I didn't want to profess to be using it if we aren't. Okay, so this is the definition, perhaps one of the most comprehensive definitions that I found of big data. It's high volume, high velocity and or high variety information assets that require new forms of processing to enable enhanced decision making, insight discovery and process optimization. So we're looking at very large data sets. We're looking at data sets that arrive on people's machines instantaneously, and we're looking at data sets that bring together all sorts of different types of media in one place for exploitation by, for instance, a research outlet or by a company or other interested parties. So that's quite a high that's quite a high level, a high bar to reach, particularly when you start thinking about what we mean by volume. So here is Mount Everest, and at the very top we can see the summit at the top here. This is the kind of massively high level of what big data looks like. Okay, and right up there at the very summit, we've got the Large Hadron Collider, which produces an astonishing 500 exabytes of information per day. Now, if I've got this right, that is 500 quintillion bytes per day. That's fairly phenomenal in terms of size, digital size. Even the kind of data bases that are collected by online companies or online structures such as YouTube and Amazon are in the kind of 40 to 50 terabytes. 1 terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes of information. These are huge data sets. So can us as little crime scientists really say that being down here at base camp with our small data sets that are less than a terabyte are really doing big data? Well, I think the real technical answer from a size perspective, absolutely not. We don't need huge distributed computer systems for what we do. So, I mean, I think we need to be a bit careful about this use of this term big data, because there is actually quite an official definition, and it's pretty hard to tick all the boxes that are required. So if we're not using big data, what are we doing? Before I go on to that, I just thought you might be quite interested in this because it really interested me. We have a very strong link in our place with the Metropolitan Police, and I asked the head of the Met data development team if he would mind telling me how big the data sets that they collect are. And this shows you the digital size of the current database extractions that the Met hold in red here. So you can see even the largest of their data sets, which is the crime record data set, which has a very extended record of each crime that's officially recorded as a crime, is only in the kind of region of 340 gigabytes, which is not really that large. This is the whole of the metadata system. But what is evident from this slide is that there's a difference between digital size and number of records. And what we can see here, for instance, is the mobile data terminals that the police have in the Metropolitan Police Service produce 500 million lines of data points per year. And the MPR records are even more dizzying because we're looking at approximately 8 to 10 million records from the AMPR data per day across the London area. That's across 3,000 distributed cameras. So there's a difference between digital size and the number of records. Okay, and we're probably a bit better at dealing with large numbers of records than we are necessarily at dealing with digital size. Okay, so let's confess it, we don't use big data. What we think we use instead is what we might call innovative data, or we use new data sets in an interesting way. And when I thought about the way in which we actually use these in crime science, I came up with 3 broad categories of different types of data that are out there and that are interesting and new that we can actually exploit for what we're trying to do. The first of these is data that's collected for administrative purposes, such as the kind of data that I was just describing from the Met. We have access to GPS police officer and vehicle tracking data, so we're going to have a look at where the patrols of the police officers go. That's a very new data set to be able to exploit. The Met say that one of their biggest data challenges to come are going to be in the information they get from the new body-worn video initiative. The police have to have this on them at all times, and there's going to be masses and masses and masses of video information that's produced by those on a daily basis. So how can we exploit those to answer interesting questions? The second set is data collected through what we call crowdsourcing. And Charlotte was sort of explaining this in a different way a little bit earlier on. And this is kind of information that's brought together by a large number of people. And the kind of crowdsourcing data that we're particularly interested in is that that's collected online and is contributed to by a large number of different people. And the kind of information that this produces is things like data on services. So for instance, there's a crowdsourced website for places that have got good access for wheelchairs, which has been contributed to by a large number of people. That's crowdsourced information. Or another one that we're really interested in is data on problems that have been encountered in environments. So Fix My Street, I don't know if anybody's heard of Fix My Street, that's one of the examples of this kind of crowdsourced data. We'll come on to that a little bit more a little bit later on. The third type of data that we're interested in using is data that's collected through new technologies. And this is stuff that we can create ourselves, but just as a result of the new technology that we've got. And so I'm going to give you an example later on of how mobile phone applications, just producing new ones of those, can produce completely different types of data set which we can then exploit for research purposes. Another more contentious one is the use of body sensors. So you might be wanting to understand how people perceive their environments, but that's going to ultimately be perception. It's not going to be really measuring truly how they feel from the point of their physiology. And one way of doing that instead is to fit people with sensors and see if there's certain environments or certain places that increase the level of sweating or their heart rate. And so we could actually collect information through body sensors, which we can then start interpreting of people feeling, for instance, fearful in particular locations. And that might be more of an objective measure than just asking people how they feel. It is an interesting question. Okay, so Some of the places where we think we've started seeing real progress from the introduction of these new innovative data sources are in theory development or in testing theory that we've had out there for a long time in crime science that we couldn't quite really get our fingers on whether or not we had any empirical evidence before for these in support or refuting these theories. To give you an example, one thing that we need to do in crime science is we need to actually approximate populations. What we need to be able to do is work out the number of people that are at a particular place at a particular time. We're not just talking about census data here, we're talking about movement data that actually represent people's what you might call routine activities through places. So, for example, it would be very helpful to us to be able to work out how many people are using the tube at any one time for a particular hour, for instance, because this makes them vulnerable to a certain type of crime for that period of time. So, for instance, mobile phone theft on the tube. And what we want to do is work out how unusual that is by estimating the number of people that are an available population for that type of crime at that time. We've never been able to do this before. But it has been possible to do this far more with things like remote sensing data now. So we have more of a dynamic population picture for places and times. Another great example is school pickup. It's great to be able to approximate the number of people that might end up being vulnerable to robbery, for instance, at those times between 3 and 4 o'clock on weekdays. But until we have sensing ways of finding these populations, we can't really approximate that risk. Another one that we're looking at is using Twitter data, social media data, to help examine the relationship between crime problems and communities. And for instance, one thing that Twitter data can do, and we all know there's huge problems with talking about Twitter data representing populations because they represent very specific populations, of course they do. But what we can start doing is having a look at data about the community that we just won't be able to collect from other places. So one particular thing, for instance, that's important in crime science is trying to work out how the community come together. And we call this social cohesion of communities. How they interact with each other, whether they pull together in particular places or whether they're quite diverse. Now, generally, this has been measured using census data in the past. But Twitter data gives us the opportunity to actually have a look at those social interactions between places. And when we've got a geographical indicator of where that's going on, we can actually start saying this community looks a little bit like this in their social interactions. And we can have a look at how that relates to crime problems in those areas. So that's one thing that one of our PhD students is doing. Now, I'm just going to come on to these last two examples, so I'm not going to go in depth. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit in a minute about how we've used crowdsourcing data to examine people's feelings about crime, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about a GPS example using this GPS policing tracking data that I discussed earlier. Okay, so just to really define what we mean by this kind of collection of information that we get from the internet, from online platforms, I just wanted to make sure that you understood what crowdsourcing was. So it's harnessing information and skills of large crowds of people in one collaborative project. Everybody knows one of the biggest crowdsourced bits of information on the internet. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Sorry? What's a really big crowdsourced? Sorry? OpenStreetMap is one, yeah? Any more that you can think of?
World War I diaries?
Yes. Anything else? Wikipedia. Wikipedia is one of the biggest ones, isn't it, when you think about it? People from all around the world are using their skills and they're coming together in one place to produce one large set of data that's speaking to a particular issue or collecting information. And here we're talking about an online encyclopedia. There's a difference between just general crowdsourcing and what we call participatory mapping. And this is when you put a geographical element into that. And you stole my example. OpenStreetMap is a fantastic example of this. And this is when people are not only using their skills to collect a topic, to collect expertise together in one place, they're also saying, and this happens here. So it's about the creation of interesting maps, and people offer their time to collect information that has a geographical component. OpenStreetMap is a great example of this, and Charlotte earlier mentioned the OS, and that's one of the only other places where you can get digital information on what a street network looks like. Now we have an open-sourced free equivalent, and that is because of a contribution from a lot of people in a lot of places to this particular project. So that's what is participatory mapping and crowdsourcing. We wanted to use this in a particular context, and that is in measurement of something called fear of crime. You've probably heard of this concept. And anyway, the fear of crime research is actually quite, has been stilted by the fact that it's traditionally measured by survey designs as a static trait of individuals. So what you do is the crime survey for England and Wales, for instance, asks the general population these questions. How afraid do you feel after dark? How afraid do you feel of the burglary problem? And in answering those questions, they then put together all this data, do a data analysis and say this is somebody's level of fear of crime. And that's using data that's supposed to have covered the entire of the last year. So somebody has a level of fear of crime for the year. Now, when you actually think about that, do we all go around feeling this level of fear all the time, right? It's unlikely, isn't it? But so the survey design doesn't enable us to have a look at the variation in people's level. So we thought, can we use some clever mapping here to have a look at variation in levels of perception of fear of crime? So what we did is my research student produced a mobile phone application, and this was to collect information on how concerned about safety people felt in different settings. So we set them loose and we say do your own routine activities, move through space, move through time, and what we'll do is we'll ping you occasionally and say how you're feeling. Or if you feel vulnerable for a particular place and time, tell us about it, and we'll have a look at how this varies over time and space. We only had a tiny little pilot study of this. We had about 60 participants, and we asked them to tell us how they felt about fear of crime over a 4-month period. This is really interesting feature of this kind of data. It's very, very clustered into participants, right? So down here we have the people who decided to do it once and got fed up with it and thought, no, I can't be bothered doing that again. Then we have the kind of people in the middle who contributed, perhaps 40, 30 times over that period of time. And then we have our curtain twitching super contributors at this end. I don't know if I'm off aim there, who decide that they want to tell us about it all the time. And they actually have told us 250 times how they felt over that 4-month period, and they're called super contributors. And this causes problems with the data because it means that it's clustered, and it means that these people who are super contributors are going to over-influence the picture that we get. So we have to be very careful about that when we're interpreting this kind of data. Don't even tell me how we did. Oh, I don't want to even tell you how we did, but you can talk to me about that at tea if you're particularly interested. So what we found, though, was really interesting, which was, as we suspected, when you charted an individual's fear of crime over time, and you can see each of these little dots here as a ping when they very kindly told us how they felt, what we can see is for the majority of the time, people didn't feel any fear at all. You know, they're just going about their daily activities, they feel fine, they're just going down to the local shop. Only occasionally did they feel any more worried, and only once did this particular individual feel very worried. Now, comparing that to a survey where this person might have remembered this incident and said, yes, I do worry about crime, is a much more nuanced, flowing picture of the way that people experience their environment. And we have one of these for all of our different participants. Why does this help with research? Well, it helps because it helps us understand these kind of aggregation biases we get in data, but we can also think about whether it can help us with policy. And what we were interested in doing is seeing whether or not if we actually think about the way that you normally predict fear of crime, can we do better now we know that it changes environmentally like this? In the past, research that looks at fear of crime has used what we call social structural variables as predictors for levels of fear. So things like age and gender, for instance. And the current literature says that females, for instance, people who are elderly, are more likely to experience higher levels of fear of crime. So these are static variables of individuals. And of course, people who have been previously victimised are also more likely to be fearful of crime. But these are all static measurements. What we did with our mobile phone app is we asked people those questions, but we also we had the locational tracking data as well. And so what we were able to do in our sort of predictive model is also put in a new variable, which is a dynamic one of whether or not the person was in their own neighbourhood when they reported that level of fear. So that's one situational variable that we were able to put into the predictive models. And yes, this is where we had to worry about the clustering of the data when we did this analysis, so it's a special type of regression analysis. But what is really obvious is even with this small experiment that we did, when you put in this locational element, everything else that was an explanation for fear of crime has dropped out. So age isn't there and gender isn't there. Instead, the only thing that predicts how people feel, according to this model, is whether they're in their local area or not when we ask them about it. If people are in their local area, they feel less fearful because they're more familiar with the place than they are when they go elsewhere. And if you think about this, this means this would be a change in policy. Well, instead of policing, so instead of having policies for fear of crime where we go and talk to individuals who we think are vulnerable, of course, because we should still be doing that, but we could also start thinking about geographical hotspots of fear in the environment, and that would be a different type of policy that we'd have to think about developing to do something about hotspots of fear rather than just hotspots of crime. Okay, so that shows, that's one way that we've used innovative data. I'm not sure how much I'm barking on. Am I, I'm okay for a bit. Okay, right, so the second example then is, I said we had GPS data from the police. Now, this is fantastic data, and we're really pleased to have been able to have the experience of working with it. I'll tell you why we had the experience of working with it in a minute or two. But you can see all these little red dots. Each of these is a GPS transmission from a police vehicle moving through the environment. So you can see, and it transmits every 15 seconds or so. So what we can actually do by having these data sets, and I'm hoping this is, I think I just pressed completely the wrong button there. Let me just see if it's going to work. Yeah, you can see that by using map matching algorithms, we can actually track where that police car went. That's a pretty accurate representation. You have to use particularly special algorithms to do this, but we can work out where the police car went, right? So for each street segment, we can then aggregate over loads of different police car tracks, and we can work out which bits of the street segments, which street segments are particularly well covered by policing vehicles on an aggregate level. Yeah, so we've got then a landscape of policing provision. Now, so we've got this kind of supply of policing that we can do at the street segment level. We thought this is really cool data to use to see whether or not the police are going to places where the demand is high for policing. You know, is that where the demand is high? So what we did is we used calls data from the police. This is just the data that the public generate when they call the police to say, I require service. And we also aggregated this up to street segment level. So we've got the kind of demand for police service, and we've got the supply from the policing cars. And you can take those two geographies away from each other, and this kind of gives you an indication of what we might call provision imbalance. So we've got the imbalance between supply and demand for policing. And here is an example of the map that is produced for Haringey using that piece of mapping. That piece of analysis. So these are the places where there's over-provision of policing compared to demand, right? And here is where you see under-provision. Are you surprised? Look at the distribution of those two maps. Are you surprised they look so different? Can you see, what kind of roads do you think these roads are? Yeah, they're the main roads, right? So there's going to be over-provision because that's all the routes that the police officers are more likely to use because they're the more central routes between places. Yeah, and you get this under-provision in the other places because exactly the reverse is happening. But we wanted to control for the amount of linkedness in the network, if you like. So, for instance, if you think about two different places, you think about this little blue dot at the top wanting to travel to another place, and this other blue dot wanting to travel, you can see that that segment in the middle is going to just get more of the coverage because it's got a high betweenness about it. It's a highly connected piece of route. You can use algorithms to calculate the level of betweenness for all those different street segments. So you can say how central that street is. So the statistical model is called the betweenness model, and it's a measure of network centrality. And so when you actually control for that, you come up with a new map, and this is for Brent in particular, which is actually just the unexplained over provision. So this is accounting for the street network structure. This is already accounting for it. We still get some places where the police have an extra tendency to go, and we still get some places where the police have a tendency not to go. And one thing that we think is quite interesting is sometimes these cluster into places. So for instance, this area here is quite an interesting area because the police obviously kind of tend to avoid this estate a little bit. And so maybe as a good strategy for operational policing service, we might say to the police, these are the kind of areas where if you're going to do high visibility policing, you should get in there and make your presence felt more. So this is a different way of using the data to help us look at the, hopefully, ultimately coming up with something that would be useful for the police, for policing purposes. So how do we get access to this data? I'm nearly finished. We only got access to this data because of our beautiful, spanking new JDR research lab. And this is actually a building at UCL, and it's a police-assured secure facility. So the Met Police have actually accredited for us, and it's a safe, actually, I shouldn't really say this, but safer than a police station. Okay, so it's got a very, very high level of physical security, but also process security. And in order to get into our lab, you have to be vetted. So we have different zones, and it's kind of got this onion skin design where it becomes more protected the more you go this way. And it's very James Bond, isn't it? So you start from the blue zone, and in order to get into the blue zone, you need to have a baseline personnel security standard check. In order to get through this through the airlock we've got here and into the red zone, you need to have a security check. And the yellow zone is very, very secure because this is where the data is housed. And the only way that you can get data into or out of this building is through the door. It's not connected to the outside world in any other way. There's no internet connection. It's completely air-gapped. And so the only way data come in and out are actually on mobile media transfer devices. So your USB thumb drive, etc. So it really is very, very secure indeed. And another thing that's really important about this security is people security. So it's not just the physical security being there; it's also having the right processes in place. And we have a well-established induction system for people that are going in there. They have to sit through and sign a form saying they've understood what the required working practices are. We have to worry about shoulder surfing. We have to worry about people writing down bits of data on a piece of paper, which they're not allowed to do, and taking them out. We have to worry about the degree to which people think, oh, it's okay if I take that USB out. Everything needs to be checked. So in order for somebody to get a JDI lab access card, they have to sit through our induction. So to conclude, crime science can gain, I think, from exploiting innovative data sets. I don't think we truly use big data in crime science yet. I'm confessing to that. I think there's scope to do those kind of things. And these opportunities to bring, there are opportunities to bring together data sets in this secure data lab setting. And what we're hoping to do is bring together data sets from loads of different disciplines. So we'll put our health data along with our crime data, for instance, and we can do that in our secure environment. I have to do the sales pitch. If you're interested in using our lab, you can use our lab. Okay, so if you're writing some sort of academic grant and you could do with access to this facility, it's very cheap. We're just trying to cover our costs. You can certainly do that. So if anybody is interested in using it or knows of somebody who might find some use for it, please do contact us or me. The email is at the bottom here. for more information for anybody who's interested, or you could just email me directly, that would be fine too. So thank you for listening, and I just wonder if there's any questions. Thank you.